He was 19 years old the first time he heard it. Not an explosion, not a torpedo, not a depth charge, just a sound. A soft, rhythmic beeping inside his headset. A gentle electronic pulse that arrived out of the darkness like a whisper. He knew exactly what it meant. He slammed his hand on the alarm. The submarine tilted. Men tumbled. Diesel engines cut out. The boat went under. 40 seconds later, the sea above them erupted. That young German sailor's name was Guschewski. He served as a radio operator on a German submarine in the Mediterranean in the later years of the war. He survived. After the war, he spoke about what it felt like to operate in the Atlantic and beyond after 1943. He said that it was a known fact among the crews that Allied aircraft were finding them day and night, using machines they did not understand and could not defeat. He said the beeping in his headset went right through him. He said that towards the end of the war, the order to dive did not come from the commander anymore. It came from him, the radio operator. Because the radio operator was the only man on the boat who knew how close death was, and death arrived at the speed of a radar beam. This is the story of how the Atlantic Ocean became a killing ground. Not for Allied ships, for German sailors. In the summer of 1942, the United States Navy had a problem so catastrophic that the men tasked with solving it could barely bring themselves to write it down in official reports. German U-boats were sinking American ships off the eastern seaboard of the United States, not in contested mid-Atlantic convoy lanes, off Florida, off Cape Hatteras, off the coast of New Jersey, in water close enough to shore that the burning hulks of merchant vessels could be seen from the beaches. American civilians watched tankers explode from the boardwalks of resort towns. The fires lit up the coastline at night like a ghastly celebration. Admiral Dönitz had dispatched his submarines to American waters in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. He called it Operation Drumbeat. The Americans had no organized convoy system, no coordinated air patrols, no adequate anti-submarine defenses. The result was industrial slaughter. In the first 6 months of 1942, German U-boats sank more than 500 ships along the American eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico. The sailors who served in this campaign called it the Second Happy Time. The first had been in 1940, against the equally unprepared British. The Doctrine Dönitz had built his entire career around was the Wolfpack. Not individual submarines hunting alone. Coordinated groups of 10, 20, 30 submarines spread across 100 miles of ocean, converging on a convoy from multiple directions under the cover of darkness. The Wolfpack depended on radio. It lived and died by high-frequency communication. A U-boat that spotted a convoy transmitted its position, course, and speed back to Dönitz's operations room. Dönitz plotted the convoy's track on a map in Lorient, France, then transmitted coordinates to every submarine within range. The pack converged. The attack began. For 3 years, this system had worked with horrifying efficiency. The British Admiralty and the American Navy both understood the threat. They poured resources into anti-submarine warfare. They built escort vessels. They trained crews. They developed sonar. They established convoy routes and instituted blackout regulations along the American coast. By mid-1942, the worst of the American coastal slaughter had been curtailed. But the Wolfpacks were still operating in the mid-Atlantic, still killing. In March of 1943, German U-boats sank 82 Allied ships in a single month, more than 400,000 tons of cargo. The Royal Navy's official historian, Stephen Roskill, would write afterward that the Germans came closer in those weeks to severing the transatlantic supply line than at any other point in the war. The experts inside the Admiralty were frightened. The frontline convoy escorts operating in the mid-Atlantic were exhausted, and Dönitz, operating from his headquarters with maps and radio transcripts and U-boat position reports, believed he was winning. He did not know what was being built against him. The problem was air power, or rather, the near-total absence of it over the mid-Atlantic. Royal Air Force Coastal Command had been fighting the U-boats from the air since 1940. The results had been dismal. In 1941, Coastal Command managed to sink exactly one U-boat in the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft available were inadequate. The radar they carried was primitive. The weapons they dropped were unreliable. And the ocean itself seemed to conspire against them. A U-boat running on the surface had excellent lookouts. It could spot an approaching aircraft at several miles in daylight. It could crash dive in 30 seconds. By the time a slow patrol aircraft could roll in and release its depth charges, the submarine was already at 60 feet and accelerating downward. The math was brutal. For thousands of hours of patrol flying, Coastal Command was producing almost no kills. But the engineers were not idle. Two technologies changed everything. The first was Centimetric Radar. The second was the Leigh Light. The older Allied airborne radar system used wavelengths of 1.5 meters. The Germans had known about this system since 1942. They had developed a radar warning receiver called MEDOX, built by a French manufacturer, that could detect the 1.5-meter radar emissions of approaching aircraft at ranges of up to 60 miles. That was 3 times further than the radar could actually detect the submarine. A U-boat crew with MEDOX had comfortable warning time. The MEDOX receiver would crackle. The watch officer would call the dive alarm. The boat would disappear. The Allied aircraft would arrive to find empty water. For several months in late 1942, German U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay were almost untouchable from the air. The MEDOX had neutralized the patrol aircraft completely. The crews began to feel confident again. Some of them called the MEDOX their guardian angel. Then, on the 5th of March, 1943, a Wellington bomber of No. 172 Squadron Royal Air Force was patrolling the Bay of Biscay on a moonless night. The aircraft was equipped with a new radar system, the Air-to-Surface Vessel Mark III, Centimetric Radar, operating on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, and it detected a U-boat on the surface at 9 miles without giving any warning to the MEDOX receiver at all. Because MEDOX could not detect 10-centimeter radar, the guardian angel had gone deaf. The Leigh Light, mounted under the Wellington's wing, threw a brilliant beam of 22 million candle power directly onto the surfaced submarine. The depth charges fell. The boat was hit before the crew even knew an aircraft was in the area. The same thing happened to a second U-boat the following night. The terrified reports began flooding back to Dönitz's headquarters. Submarines attacked on the surface at night. No radar warning, no visual contact with the aircraft, just darkness. Then sudden, blinding light. Then the water exploding around them. Survivors reported that the aircraft had appeared out of nothing. It had simply materialized overhead in the beam of its own searchlight and dropped its bombs before anyone could reach the dive alarm. Imagine you are a German submariner in the spring of 1943. You left port in Lorient 4 days ago. The Bay of Biscay crossing takes roughly 4 days on the surface. You need to run on the surface to charge your batteries and make speed. You have done this before. You have MEDOX. You feel relatively safe. Now the MEDOX is silent. And something is killing boats that should be safe. 4 days of transit. 4 days of watching the horizon. 4 days of every man on deck scanning the darkness for a silhouette they will not see until it is directly overhead. The sound you learn to fear is not an explosion. It is the sudden intrusion of light. The psychological effect on the crews was immediate and profound. By April of 1943, Coastal Command was finding U-boats in the Bay of Biscay at a rate that seemed impossible to the Germans. Sightings that in late 1942 had dropped to almost zero were now occurring almost daily. The submarines had not changed. The patrol routes had not changed. What had changed was the radar in the aircraft overhead. Dönitz tried to adapt. He ordered submarines to transit the bay submerged during the night, when the aircraft were most active, and to surface during the day when Luftwaffe fighters could provide some protection. Coastal Command responded by forming strike wings of Bristol Beaufighter aircraft, fast, aggressive aircraft that attacked in coordinated groups. They came in low and fast, and made one run and disappeared before German anti-aircraft gunners could properly track them. The submarines were now being hunted day and night. There was no safe window. The 2nd of May, 1943. Convoy ONS 5. 42 merchant ships, bound westward from Liverpool to Halifax. Wind force 7. 8-foot seas. Water temperature 2 degrees above freezing. The convoy is roughly 400 miles southeast of Greenland. Dönitz has assembled more than 40 submarines from the Wolfpacks codenamed Star and Amsel. More than 40 boats converging on one convoy. It is one of the largest concentrations of German submarine force assembled anywhere in the Atlantic War. The first contact report goes out. A U-boat radio operator keys his transmitter. The signal is brief. 10 seconds. Convoy position, course, speed, encrypted, compressed, as short as possible. On board the frigate HMS Tay, the high-frequency direction-finding oscilloscope lights up. A bearing appears. An estimate of range. The watch officer reads it. The Tay turns and accelerates. Aboard the convoy's other escorts, high-frequency direction-finding receivers are picking up the same transmission. A second bearing. Triangulation begins. The contact keeper's position is now known to within a few miles. The destroyer turns toward the bearing, full speed. 4 miles. 3 miles. The lookouts strain into the gray. The U-boat is still on the surface, still transmitting, still guiding in the rest of the pack. It does not see the destroyer coming. 2 miles. The crash dive alarm sounds on the U-boat. Too late. The destroyer is already swinging into a depth charge run. The depth charges go over the side. They fall. They detonate. Columns of white water erupt in the gray swell. The submarine is driven deeper. Hull plates groan. Now the ASDIC sonar pings begin. The submarine is 300 feet down. It is still. The crew does not speak. Some of the men have been depth charged before. Others are on their first patrol. The young ones are pressing their hands flat against the cold metal walls. They can hear the propellers of the destroyer above them. They can hear the pinging of the sonar bouncing off their hull. They can hear the mechanism of the depth charge throwers being reloaded. Then, the second pattern falls. The lights go out. A pipe cracks in the forward section. Water begins to seep. The diving officer reports minor damage. The commander orders a change of course. Slow. Dead slow. Below the thermocline layer, where the temperature change of the water might deflect the sonar beam. They survive this attack. They surface 4 hours later. They transmit a damage report to headquarters. The oscilloscope on HMS Tay lights up again. The battle around Convoy ONS 5 lasts 8 days. 13 merchant ships are sunk, but 6 U-boats are destroyed. Others are damaged and driven off. The contact keepers who attempt to shadow the convoy and maintain the radio net that Dönitz's entire strategy depends on are being hunted every time they transmit. The Wolfpack begins to lose coherence. Submarines that cannot communicate, cannot coordinate. They begin operating independently. They begin missing opportunities. They begin dying alone. By the night of the 5th to the 6th of May, the attack is breaking apart. Dönitz receives increasingly fragmented reports. Submarines driven under. Submarines reporting aircraft contact. Submarines failing to re-establish contact with the convoy. The brilliant, synchronized, multi-directional attack that was supposed to overwhelm the escort is dissolving into chaos. On the 24th of May, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz sat in his operations room and wrote a message to the submarines still at sea in the North Atlantic. He told them to withdraw. He did not use that word. He used operational language, reassessment, tactical repositioning, preservation of assets. But the meaning was clear to every officer who read it. The Wolfpacks were being pulled back. For the first time since 1939, the German submarine force was in strategic retreat. In the same month, Dönitz sent a report to Adolf Hitler. It was remarkable in its honesty. He wrote that the enemy, by means of location devices, was making fighting impossible and was causing heavy losses. He said they were facing the greatest crisis in submarine warfare. He still believed it was radar alone. He still did not fully understand the high-frequency direction-finding network. He did not know that every transmission from every submarine was being triangulated from shore stations in England, Iceland, Greenland, and Bermuda. He did not know that the escort frigates themselves were reading his radio net in real time and turning toward his submarines before the transmissions were even finished. He was a man staring at his losses and looking for a technological answer to what was, at its core, a strategic catastrophe. The casualties in May alone were 41 submarines. More boats lost in 1 month than in the entire year of 1941. Among those 41 crews were hundreds of junior officers who represented the next generation of submarine commanders. They were gone. Their experience was gone. The men Dönitz sent out afterward were younger, less experienced. They knew the odds in a way that the men of 1942 had not. They went to sea, knowing that U-boat crews were now dying at a rate of 75% before the war's end. 28,000 German sailors killed, mostly after 1943. The fear did not stay at sea. It came back with the survivors into the ports of Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire. It lived in the faces of the men who returned, the ones who had heard the beeping in the headset, the ones who had felt the boat shudder under a depth charge pattern and not known if the next one would be closer. Peter Peterson, 20 years old, sailing aboard the German submarine U-518 inches the summer of 1943, described what it was like. He described being caught by 6 American destroyers after an unsuccessful torpedo attack. He described the destroyers making run after run, hours of depth charges, explosions all around the hull. He said the crew had to simply take it. There was nothing else to do. That phrase, they had to take it. It is the most honest thing any man who served in a German U-boat after 1943 ever said. By the end of the war, roughly 1,180 German submarines had entered service. 863 of them went on war patrol. Of those, nearly 650 were sunk. Of the 37,000 men who served in German submarines, 28,000 were killed at sea. The majority of those deaths came after Black May of 1943. Coastal Command alone destroyed 212 U-boats before the German surrender in May of 1945. They completed 1 million flying hours, 240,000 operations. The ocean did not change. The submarines did not fundamentally change. What changed was the invisible electromagnetic architecture that surrounded every German boat the moment it surfaced. Centimetric radar that could not be detected. Direction-finding systems that turned radio communication into a death sentence. Leigh lights that turned the dark into noon without warning. The Wolfpack was a weapon built on coordination, on communication, on the assumption that the Atlantic was vast enough to hide in. It was not. Not anymore. The German sailor who described hearing the beeping in his headset said something else that stayed with him all his life. He said that the crew had to completely rely on the radio operator, because the radio operator was the only man who knew when death was coming. That is what the Atlantic became after 1943. Not a battlefield, not a hunting ground, a place where death came from the sky without warning, where the sound of your own radio transmitter was the sound of a targeting system locking onto your hull, where the darkness offered no safety and the silence offered no peace, because the aircraft overhead were listening even when you could not hear them. The Germans called their submarines iron coffins. They built that name themselves before the war ended. They earned it. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might find it meaningful. Let me know in the comments what you'd like me to cover next. I'll see you in the next one.